Yeah, Vicky still, she was doing a little better and then got hit again with that cold stuff yesterday. And so she's been down. She's hadn't left the house since Thursday last week. And Dennis Ross took on a bad migraine today. And then Elizabeth, one of the kids, tested positive for influenza. And so they're dealing with that. So we've just got a lot of things going on with our own members here. And as Tim alluded to, of course, in the prayer as well. And a couple of individuals have passed away that we've been announcing a lot, but as they're sick, but for both Les Mace and Jeff Payne, families, people to remember. I'm glad you're able to be here tonight. And as we look at this material, and if you look on page 31 at the top on section F, uncial codices, I want us to understand that there are several important codices, what we might just say codex uncial manuscripts, that are invaluable witnesses to the Greek New Testament, and some of them to the entire Bible, the Old Testament as well. And there are really 7 or 8 that stand out. There's more than that, but they're, because of the age and because of the content of 7 particular codices, these again become very important in reference to the validation of the biblical text, of the biblical canon. And the first 4 that we're going to look at are often referred to as the great uncials. And these are handwritten uncials, of course. And when we say uncial, just remember that is an uppercase writing. And so all the Greek letters are in the uppercase, and basically no spaces between the words and the sentences. It's a running text. These are all on vellum. Beautiful examples of vellum can be found up at Hearst Castle. I've seen some of the lampshades up there that are made out of vellum. It's a really great example. So when we're talking about that, these are on vellum. That is calf skin, of course. And when we say that they're a codex, what do we mean by that then? It's an uncial. What's that? Wait, go ahead. Yeah, so in other words, it's actually put together like a book where there is a seam sewed down the middle. And on either side of your pages, there can be 1 or 2, even 3 columns, depending on the uncial that we would be looking at. In the last 100 years or so, and so I'm talking about really the late 1800s, but early 1900s, scholars have discovered that manuscripts can be grouped into these different families because the style of lettering that were used in the copying process that each manuscript has gone through. And basically the 4 groups are the Alexandrian, the Byzantine, the Western, and the Caesarean. And those are the most well known. Now there is a version, a translation, that was based from these early manuscripts that was referred to as, and you've heard this expression from time to time, as the Textus Receptus, which is Latin, which really means received text, the received text. And an eminent scholar by the name of Erasmus and others that had been involved in the translation of the King James Version of the Bible in the late 1500s going on into the 1600s, because the typical King James Version that we're used to, that we talk about, what date is normally assigned to the King James Version? 1611. Yeah, 1611. Now understand that there were other English versions that predated the King James, and even the King, as far as the King James, this was a work in progress. But the King James Bible relied on a late version of a Byzantine type text family, and very much, as we're going to be talking about in a few moments, on the Codex Alexandrinus. And it's an early witness to this particular family of transcripts. And so I want us to look at a few of these. Now, I'm going to go in the order, and sometimes the order is different. That a lot of times that they'll say that the most important transcript, and that becomes somewhat relative, is the Sinaiticus. But I want to start with the Vaticanus because it is the earliest, the oldest of the known manuscripts. And while it was not the first of the major four that were discovered, it was not the first discovered, but yet, once it was discovered, then we know that it is as I have up there, a 4th century AD manuscript, the Vaticanus. And again, a vellum manuscript containing the Gospels, all 4 Gospels, the book of Acts, the Pauline epistles, and there are also some other writings that are associated with what are sometimes referred to as the universal epistles, but that typically the Catholic epistles, remember that just means universal from the standpoint, these were the non-Pauline, and so these other writings or epistles would include the Peter's epistles, John's epistles, Jude, so forth. And it is at the Vatican Library in Vatican City, and it is, again, one of the 4 great uncials that we read about. I have some samples of it. One of the interesting things, and we're probably going to talk about this coming up in a week or two, if you look to the right, you see this is the last page of the book of Mark in the Vaticanus manuscript. And who can remember off the top of their head the controversy that surrounds Mark chapter 16?
15 and 16 are left out.
Yeah, so in Mark chapter 16, that there were 2 of the early manuscripts, including this manuscript, that comes to an end at verse 8, Mark 16, 1 through 8. You may have a Bible. The NIV does this. The ESV puts a margin note at the bottom. Some of the translations will point out, and they sometimes might say something like, 2 reliable manuscripts do not contain verses 9 through 20. Now, that's true that there are 2 that did not. I'll have more to say about that later, but understand that there are other ancient manuscripts and a great amount of other copies of manuscripts that do contain verses 9 through 20. But it is an interesting situation here, because what you have here with the Gospel of Mark, in fact, that's really what it says at the bottom there. You see where it looks like it's a K-A-T-A, kata. Kata, then what we have is Marcon of Mark. And so that kind of a stamp was put there with a little bit of the artwork in that particular codex. But that ends at verse 8. All right? And so then I just brought out some other pages. And again, this has a few different styles that are found within the one manuscript itself. And we see that that there is a little bit of artwork that was done by these scribes as, chapters begin or whatever the case may be. But notice that this is a three-column manuscript. And as opposed to, we're going to see some that are 2-column. There are some that are 1-column. And this, we will look at this, and you can get dimensions of this. In fact, I may have dimensions of this somewhere, I'm not sure. This is written on, the Vaticanus is written on 759 what they call leaves. Those pages are actually what they call leaves of vellum in the uncial letters. And it has been dated paleographically to the 4th century. And there's a very, very, very high percentage of that being accurate of when it was. The manuscript became known to Western scholars as a result of this communication between Erasmus, who I mentioned earlier, and those that were known as the prefects of the Vatican. And so the Codex's relationship to the Latin Vulgate, that we're going to talk about a little bit later, is unclear. But you got to understand that when the Latin Vulgate was done by Jerome in the 5th century, which is going to be about a century later than the date of the Vaticanus. Again, there's not unanimous agreement. Was the Vulgate based upon the Vaticanus? There are some that believe that some of the differences in the two texts, not controversial differences by virtue of changing of meaning or accounts, but just probably more syntactically in the style. There are some scholars that believe that the Vaticanus was not the source that was used to do Jerome's Latin Vulgate. So there's some unclarity to that. But don't forget, the Latin Vulgate was the translation of the version that was used for a good number of centuries, especially by virtue of the fact what language was spoken for centuries and centuries in the Roman Church's masses? Well, Latin, of course. And how many people were speaking Latin? You know, as the time went on, very few people were speaking Latin except for the educated clerics, the clergy's members. Now, of course, understand this is not Latin. What language are we talking about here? This is Greek. So these uncials are Greek uncials. Okay. So it is a very, very important manuscript that we have. As far as to the contents, again, these manuscripts also have, some of these manuscripts contain some of the other non-canonical writings, although the Catholic Church has embraced some of them. How many of you have heard of the books of the Maccabees? The Maccabees. And so the Vaticanus does include the first, the 1, 2, 3, and 4 books of the Maccabees, and what is also a book known as the Prayer of Manasseh. It again has some other of the books that are often referred to as the Apocrypha, and not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus, Judith, Tobit, and so those are some books that you may from time read in particular reference books. As I said as well, that when this particular manuscript is at the Vatican Library, and so that's where it is housed today. And do you may have any questions, or I know Tim, you've done some.
Where was it located initially? Do you know that?
I'm sorry, David.
Where was it located initially?
Oh, where it was located initially. You know, it was. All we know is it was kept in the Vatican Library since the 15th century. Now, how long they had it, and I remember reading something about this a long time ago, but how long they had it before it became known and revealed to others is a really good question. They could have had that, David, for a good number of years in their Vatican Library. And I always find this interesting, too, that when we're talking about the codices, the papyri that were the possession of the Roman Catholic Church, and with the translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, and keeping the Bible out of the hands of the common people. I mean, do we understand what's going on with that? What is going on with that, would you suppose? That the Bible was not going to be easily translated into common languages. What happened to individuals like Wycliffe and Tyndale, who were the first ones, the pioneers of translating the Latin Vulgate into the English language? They were martyred. And the one, as far as, I believe it was Wycliffe, anyway, one of them had died already, but they literally dug his body up and then burned his body with his books in a public burning. And then his ashes were put in like one of the main rivers or something. But they were branded as heretics for daring to translate the Bible into a common language. Again, who alone was speaking could be conversive in Latin? The clerics. And so we hear those situations where Bibles are chained to pulpits. We understand the situation where people just don't have access to the Bible as we do. And so when you have these manuscripts that are going to be very revealing as to what the Scripture says, Do you suppose there might have been at times an agenda to keep that away from common public knowledge? That's an embarrassing part of history for them. Luke?
As I say, it happens today in different congregations and everything else, where they refuse to talk about these particular things, refuse to
Yeah.
get into, and they are blind.
Right.
And the number, I just had a luncheon today and at the LDS church in San Luis Obispo, and the lack of knowledge that is there that is so simple, but the lack of knowledge from Scripture.
Right.
Because they just, and they've got it. It's 2019. We have so many different resources.
Right.
And the lack of knowledge on this.
Yeah.
And then the fact is, well, you don't know about that.
No, and there was never an encouragement. And again, once the Bible was translated, and not just in English, as it was translated into the common German language, a lot of the work by John Calvin, for example. But and then with the work of Calvin and then the result of the French Calvinists, which were called the Huguenots, the French Huguenots. But when the Bible is now being translated into French, it's translated into Spanish, it's translated, when you look at the major European languages, understand that the more languages that it's translated into, then the more potential of people being able to read the Scripture. And this becomes very threatening to that which had been concealed doctrinally, theologically in the Roman Church for so many years. Okay? Is there anybody else? Does that make sense? Yeah, Tim.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this already, you probably did, but that word extant.
That means what's available today.
Okay, but I mean, was it complete? What they found was the complete Scripture. I realize they didn't have all of Mark 16 in there, but was it? It's interesting that it's in order as we have them.
Right.
Even as you have the examples up there at the end of Luke, beginning of John, and anyway, was it the order that we see in the Bible today?
Not all the manuscripts are the exact orders we see today. Are the books there? Yes, they are.
Yeah.
And some of them are, and we're going to see with some of them. In fact, that was the next thing I was going to, of what's in the Vaticanus and what's not. So, obviously, as we've said, verses not in the Vaticanus was not only Mark 16, but there are a lot of other individual verses that are missing. Some of them because of tears in the manuscript. Some of them because it looked like they got wet and smeared and they're not legible. You have some phrases, and so there's some whole verses that are missing. Then there are some phrases that are missing from the Vaticanus that are found in the other manuscripts. And you're going to find this to be the case with all of the manuscripts. Is there one manuscript extant do we have today that contains every verse of what we know as the Bible today from Genesis to Revelation? No, absolutely not. Okay? And there'll be pages or leaves there. Wait till we talk about the Sinaiticus and what, because of that manuscript and what Tischendorf discovered, what happened there, which is going to illustrate the point. Did you have a follow-up thought about that?
And that could be from what we've been talking about a lot too, is that whoever copied it or whoever took it from one place to another could have made a mistake too in copying as well, the things that are missing.
Right. One of the things that is a little out of order, it's unusual that they found because of this ending in Mark, is that typically what they would do, what these manuscripts, including the Vaticanus, that as a book ended, then the other book started right up immediately, same page. There again, the end of Luke, the beginning of John. Y'all see that? And the same thing here, because the order was different. This illustrates the order will be different. In our Bibles, does Hebrews come right after 2 Thessalonians? Obviously not. We have a good number of books that come after 2 Thessalonians. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, right? And so but what I want you to notice was the common factor, and I remember some of those that remember Bill Layton from way back when. One of the things he brought out in his defense of Mark 16 and the validity of 9 through 20 is that when you look at the manuscript, that what was common is that when one book ended, the other book began. But when we come, and this is blown up, you understand, this to the right is blown up with Mark. And so Mark ends, if Mark ends at verse 8, what should be taking place immediately after that? Luke. But it's not. Instead, it comes to this end, there's this artwork and this stamp, and it goes to a different page. That is an anomaly. That is inexplicable. Nobody's been able to sufficiently answer why is that the case when this is the common practice when you look at the leaves of the Vaticanus, which has caused many, when you want to talk about conspiracy theories, was somebody trying to sabotage the end of the book of Mark. And you're always going to have some of our brethren, and I understand this, where Bill Layton was way back when. He thought that it was an attempt to remove the Great Commission of Mark 16, 15 through 16, but even through the end of the book in verse 20 that deals with the signs and miracles that the apostles would perform and so forth. So it's a very fascinating study, but that is an anomaly. Does that make sense to everybody what I'm saying there? Does that make sense? Okay, that's a great question point, Tim. There's just so many things about each of these that we could bring out. What I want to go to next, and I can tell where we're going tonight, and it's not as far as I thought we're going to go, but never do, right? Are we surprised by that, right? But before we go and before we talk about the next manuscript, the Sinaiticus, we've got to talk about this individual, and that's really Konstantin von Tischendorf is really his last name. His first name is Lobegat Friedrich Konstantin von Tischendorf. That's a mouthful. Okay. He was born on January 18th, 1815, to give you perspective. He died in December of 1874. He was a world-leading biblical scholar of his time. And in 1844, he discovered the world's oldest and most complete Bible dating from 325 AD. So another 4th century manuscript that's going to be very, very close to the same age as the Vaticanus. All right? And and so when you asked him about, having all the books and all the verses, well, we'll say this, one thing we're going to see, that when we look at the Sinaiticus that he found, that he discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, that this was the most complete Bible, with the complete New Testament never having been discovered before, but this did have the complete New Testament. That makes it hugely important. And the Codex can be seen either in the British Library in London, or a digitized version. You can go, and now the British Library for some time is you can look at the entire manuscript online that they've digitized, okay? And again, it is listed as one of the great discoveries of the biblical manuscripts. He was given honorary doctorates at both Oxford University, Cambridge University. This find at the time was considered to be the greatest find discovery of any type of antiquitous writings, and he also was one of the first when he was a student. He's a sharp guy. He was gaining his academic degree back in the 1840s, and he earned international recognition when he deciphered one of the other codices, the codex that we're going to be talking about, the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, which is a 5th century Greek manuscript, and he deciphered that, and he was still yet a student. And so just telling you, showing that how knowledgeable he was in the biblical languages. The Codex Sinaiticus, we're going to talk about that, and so I just went ahead and showed this one page, which is a copy, obviously, of a page of the Codex Sinaiticus. And I got to get the right thing here. I'll shut the machine off if I use that one. Let's see here. There we go. And so it is identified because it is really considered to be one of the great first discoveries of the Bible, that it was assigned as an abbreviation identification code as the Aleph. And so when you look where it says Codex Sinaiticus, then that fundamental figure in the parentheses is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, when it was understood that the Vaticanus was an older manuscript, that it actually was assigned a capital letter A. A capital letter A. And but the Aleph in the Hebrew was, and again, this is the middle 4th century. And I have a copy. I have copies of Esther and a text right out of Luke chapter 11, Matthew 6, just some examples of this. Now, the history of this is fascinating, and I want to read something to you in the discovery, because this is just absolutely one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. It's called The Sisters of Sinai, and how these two ladies that were absolute experts in biblical languages, and this has taken us back in the early 1900s, they decided to take this journey and to go to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai and to start going to all these areas where important biblical manuscripts were found. And they did research like you cannot believe. How two lady adventurers discovered the hidden Gospels, okay? But when they talk about Tischendorf, and then the Janet Saskais, I think is how you pronounce her name, wrote this book about these ladies. But the story of Tischendorf and the Sinaiticus is really an account that has become quite popular, those that are interested in this history. And I just want to read to you that his discovery and what he said when he came into this monastery. And so here's this monastery again, and it's called St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Think of the Sinai Peninsula and all of that. And Tischendorf gives this account and describes the great discovery at Sinai. And he's a little ambiguous, but I just want you to hear this. He says, "It was at the foot of Mount Sinai, in the convent of St. Catherine, that I discovered the pearl of all my researches. In visiting the library of the monastery in the month of May, 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments, and the librarian, who was a man of information, told me that 2 heaps of papers like these were moldering at the time, had already been committed to the flames because they've been sitting and so old that they were getting mold. They had already burnt an amount of these leaves. What was my surprise to find amid the heaps of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek. Because don't forget, this is a Greek manuscript, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient I had ever seen. The authorities of the convent allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were destined for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I displayed had aroused their suspicions as to the value of this manuscript. We don't know how much of it had been destroyed. Now, he was able to cleverly get back at some times and confiscate other parts of this, but this is just amazing to me of the Sinaiticus and again, of the Greek text of the New Testament, but also of the Old Testament. And so now this, when you think about it, along with the Vaticanus, so with the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, and now having those two, think about the ability now to check what had been known as the Bible, and translated as the Bible, and to verify its authenticity with these texts that obviously were written close to the same time period, but at different times by different people, stored in different places for centuries and centuries. What do you suppose the skeptics might have felt that in the translating of the Vaticanus and in the translation of the Sinaiticus, what do you suppose that they would find between that? The skeptics, at least, and the cynics would like to be able to find discrepancies. But of course, but the discrepancies are not found. Okay? And so we understand that at the time, the Vaticanus was available and was depended upon a lot, with the Sinaiticus, and even to be more complete, this was a huge discovery. And it assumes that at one time that the whole of both Testaments must have been included, because the amount of Old Testament was found and the amount of New Testament that it did have. Tim?
When I was doing research, it also seemed like they were discovering, even into this century, they discovered...
Oh, the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah, I mean this...
Yeah, this century, exactly. Yeah, in fact, that's what I've got that same material probably looking at with material discovered in the 20th, 21st centuries. And because this is not just found in one codex or manuscript that's housed in one places, there are parts of the Sinaiticus that are in lots of different libraries and universities. And so it's not just in one place. So there are parts of the Sinaiticus in various places. Okay? Again, you could go and find a list of omitted verses, omitted phrases, that you have some, differentiations in translation, anyway, so, but it became a huge find. The next particular codex, and I just have a little bit because at least we can do what we call the big three, is the Alexandrinus that I've referred to. So we've talked about the Vaticanus, we've talked about the Sinaiticus. Now the Codex Alexandrinus, and this is Codex A. I'm sorry, I was mistaken when I said the Vaticanus. This is the A Codex, and it's a 5th century AD codex, and of its importance, even though it's a century later, again, because of its contents. It also is written on vellum pages. It contains the Gospels, Acts, all of the Pauline epistles, again, the universal epistles, and the book of Revelation. And it is kept at the British Library in London. And also a sample of the Byzantine family of the style of writing in which it was given. This particular codex has become very, very important, and all three have, but when you look at these three, into what is called the translation and the work of Westcott and Hort. And as a matter of fact, in the interlinear that I have here, this is an interlinear Greek-English New Testament interlinear. And it is based on the Nestle-Aland text, and this one is translated and done. This work is done by Alfred Marshall. But this, of course, is based upon what's called Westcott and Hort. And so much of the being able to develop this kind of an interlinear is because of the presence of the Codex Alexandrinus, as well as Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But it was, again, very, very important into the verification of what the Scriptures had taught, as far as and what they actually said. Again, when it comes to the textual features and much of the Old Testament, one of the things that I read about this, that it's called the Alexandrinus because traditionally Alexandria is considered the place of its origin. You had asked, for example, where the one codex was found. Well, this was housed for a number of years in Alexandria, Egypt. And then in time, an individual by the name of Syro-Lucarius, that he took it basically and it went from Alexandria to Constantinople. And so when we look at the Grecian influence there, but it received and it stuck because as it's being founded and was at Alexandria for so long, is called the Codex Alexandrinus. Just as the Vaticanus, because it's housed in the Vatican. Sinaiticus, because it was at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, at the foot of Mount Sinai, is where that is. If you anybody ever seen the pictures of St. Catherine's Monastery? It's all over the internet when you just start looking this stuff up. And really, really cool monastery at the hillside at the base of the mountain. So, people say, where do they come up with these names? Do you have any other thoughts or comments about that? What I want to look at next week or the following, I want to look at the following, and they're listed on your page 31, is the Washington Codex, which is the Washingtonianus, and the Ephraime and the Bezae. And then we'll look at 7 and 8. I have a little bit of information about the Amiatinus, I guess that is, in the Corridethi Codex. And we'll talk about that. But I really want to spend some time with the codices 4, 5, and 6. And really get through that, because then that's going to be done. We're going to hand out lesson 6. We have some more information in the outline, in your study guide or outline, about the importance of these manuscripts to Christianity today. Read that. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to get to lessons 6 and 7, talking about the New Testament canon, and then the Old Testament canon, and then the correlation to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that all becomes critically important as well. Tom?
You said the big three. Is that because of their completeness?
It is two things. Number one, it's because of their age. These are the oldest manuscripts that we have available, that when you're talking about 4th and 5th century, now the 4th century is the 300s, and so look how close that is. These manuscripts are to the 1st century AD of the church in the apostolic age, and even John, who made it to, looks like he lived right about to the turn of the 2nd century. So they're very important because of their age, but they're also very important because of what they do contain and the amount, yes, of the biblical text they contain and the agreement for the most part. They're all missing some parts here, and there are some differences that way, but to the vast amount of agreement between them. And so that's what makes them so very, very important. When you look at others, we talked about several weeks ago, other works of antiquity, and the copies that we have of some of those historical things, their separation of when they were originally written into anything that we have available, copies of those, are centuries and centuries apart. There's not this closeness of proximity of these kinds of manuscripts to the actual apostolic times. And the amount of them, the copies of them, the agreement of them, all lend to their veracity. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I just know there's older documents, but they're not at all complete. They're just little parts.
That's right. There are fragments and pieces there even. And then don't forget, the Dead Sea Scrolls are older too. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are not Greek manuscripts and that do not deal with the New Testament at all. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, also had a lot of non-biblical literature. But what it does contain is a great amount of the Old Testament written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Those documents predate the birth of Christ, but they're Old Testament. So they're older, but it's Old Testament. This is the oldest that we have with this much completeness to it that takes us to that part. Yeah.
That's why they're the big three.
Yeah, they are. They are. And a lot of people, again, will also include the Ephraim as being about as just important as Codex as well, which is also either a 4th or 5th century Codex. Okay, we got to quit. We're out of time. But that's a good question. Okay, thank you very much. We shall continue.